Well, good afternoon, and thank you for sticking around for what has been a really good conference over the past 2 days. I'm honored to be a part of this panel. I've been able to present with Anastasia last year, and I'm grateful to HREC for including me in all of their conferences. I think I've only missed one that they've had, so I've been to almost all of them. So today I want to offer a presentation on the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine and their archive, as well as some new research that I'm doing in my dissertation based on this very collection. So, as mentioned by so many other scholars during this conference over the past 2 days, there's a wealth of information related to the Holodomor in several archives outside of the former Soviet Union. Today I want to build on the sources that so many others have been gracious enough to share with us at this conference, and I want to share some insights into the archive of the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine, which I will refer to as the CUF from here on out. What I want to do today is break up my short presentation into 2 parts. The first part of my talk will discuss the CUF archive, its background, and some of the documents available in the collection. In the second part of my talk, I will present some new research that is based on the testimonies from the CUF collection, and I hope to show that the testimonies and documents present in the CUF archive are key to understanding, in more complex ways, the history of the Holodomor and the people who suffered through it. I contend that the CUF archive should be a starting point for researchers rather than an ending point, and I think that the source should appear more regularly in published works. One of the reasons that the CUF archive is not utilized as often as it should be, I think, is due to researchers' unfamiliarity with it. Those who have worked on the 1932-33 famine for some time will be familiar with the Commission's work, but others may not know of its existence. References to the Commission and their work appears sporadically in some of the Holodomor research, and most recently, the testimonies were used in Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine. Perhaps more surprising is the reference to the CUF in last year's state proclamations and resolutions that mark the 85th anniversary of the famine. Several U.S. states issued documents marking the Holodomor as genocide based on the findings of the CUF in the late 1980s. It might seem then that the CUF remains on the periphery of thought in regard to Holodomor study. However, as I will discuss today, the CUF collection is rich in testimony and other useful documents related to oral history, American foreign policy during the Cold War, and education campaigns to introduce the Holodomor into U.S. school curriculum. Another reason I think the CUF archive has not been fully utilized, particularly the testimonies, is due to researchers' distrust of memory as a source. Now, I don't think I'm speaking to anyone in this room, as we had this conversation yesterday when Frank brought this to light, but I do constantly face backlash from researchers at other conferences on memory as a source and its reliability, and particularly this collection. I hear often from scholars that they think the testimonies are biased and unreliable, and that they cannot be used because they were collected so late after the famine occurred, approximately 50 years after the famine concluded. While I have found some inconsistencies in the testimonies during my work with them, I find them to be no more problematic than any other type of source. In fact, I find it ironic that we have privileged Soviet archival sources which deny the severity and intent of the famine while distrusting the testimonies of those who witnessed it firsthand. These testimonies, when read against each other and with other archival sources, provide a much more robust and complex picture of events surrounding the Holodomor. They also present a much-needed social history and give us insight into the experiences of everyday Ukrainians. The CUF documents are located in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, not in the DC office, and there are approximately 20 boxes of documents related to the Commission's work. The CUF officially established in 1985, but they did not begin their formal work until early 1986. They would wrap up their investigation in 1988, and they would later publish their 3-volume oral history project in 1990. The CUF collection includes the Commission's first and second interim reports to Congress, their final report to Congress, and the previously mentioned testimonies. The collection also includes an array of letters from Holodomor survivors who wrote into the CUF director, or the staff director, James Mace, to express their interest in sharing their experience. Some of these letters even include written testimony. Some of these individuals would eventually testify at one of the 6 hearings that the Commission held across the United States during their tenure, but other testimony in the letters remains unused and was not included in the CUF's final report to Congress. The CUF archive is also rich in other primary source material that they collected as part of their investigation. This includes both American and Soviet newspapers, academic work that addressed the 1932-33 famine, and educational material that was prepared for school districts across the United States. There are pamphlets, genocide curriculums, promotional materials that were designed by Dr. Miron Koropis, the architect of the education campaign for the CUF. These documents will be of particular interest to those studying how Holodomor curriculum was implemented in schools, or at least attempted. The archive also holds a small amount of demographic information related to Holodomor survivors. The CUF compiled a chart, which is shown behind me, that broke down where survivors had lived in Ukraine. Now, beyond telling us where some of these survivors had come from, it's broken down here by oblasts. It also tells us what their occupations were, the years they were born, and it's broken down by gender as well. This tells us something about where these survivors lived during the famine, and one could read these testimonies and compare the experiences of those from different regions in Ukraine. This is something that is still largely lacking in current research. One will also find in this collection the question sheets that interviewers used when collecting testimonies from survivors. So as you can see here, there were two sets of questions based on those who lived in either rural or urban settings. Now, there are obviously more than two sets of questions, but it's broken down largely by urban and rural divides. So I know it's hard to see some of these questions, but if you look, we can get a glimpse of how these questions led to some of the answers that the survivors would provide. So one of them asks, was there famine in Russia? How do you know? Why was there famine in Ukraine? They lead us in a certain direction, and they led the survivors in a certain way too to respond to certain things that the interviewers would ask. This gives us a glimpse of the way that questions were formed, and it tells us a great deal about what the survivors decided to share and what they decided to leave out of their testimonies. As part of my own dissertation work, I have interviewed some members of the CUF, and one of the staff interviewers explained to me that the oral interview questions were quite contested, and that they do not reveal all of the information that was gathered. This is just one example of the type of research that stemmed from working with this collection. Those looking to work with survivor testimony will find a great deal of source material both in the CUF's interim reports and in the 3-volume collection of testimony. The interim reports have a surprising amount of testimony in the English language, and the 3-volume oral history collection has hundreds of pages of Ukrainian language content. Some topics and themes that I have encountered while working with this collection include gender, education, children, cannibalism, resistance, collectivization, deportation, and the little-studied famine of 1946-47. No doubt, others will find even more topics to write about after working with these testimonies on their own. But today I want to share some new research that is the result of working with these testimonies. This research concerns the aftermath of the famine, and today I will share with you some recent work that is part of my larger dissertation project. So my dissertation, tentatively titled at the moment, it's a work in progress, In the Aftermath of Hunger, Coming to Terms with Famine in Soviet Ukraine, 1933 to 1988, explores the years after the 1932-33 famine, including the 1946-47 famine. My work examines the aftermath period and the efforts of Ukrainians and Ukrainian society to recover and reestablish, or what might be referred to in Ukrainian as vidnovluvate. I see the years after the famine as some of the most fundamental in terms of Ukrainians really starting to grapple with the effects of starvation, lost family members, and the predicament of moving on. Today, however, I want to turn back to 1933, technically the last year of the famine, but also the deadliest. This year marks the start of the end of famine, and it is where I see the immediate aftermath period begin. To start to understand the immediate aftermath of the 1932-33 famine, one must start with the dead. The testimonies from the CUF archive are particularly useful for understanding this topic, and they help to elucidate a social history of the famine, albeit a very dark one. The testimonies are significant because they speak to the silences that hide in other types of sources. I started to think about the dead and the bodies of those who died during the famine after combing through survivor testimony over the past several years. I noticed a particular attention to the dead that several testimonies often referenced. Of course, it was hard not to notice the millions who died, the pile of corpses that littered the streets, the half-dead laying in front yards, and the mass graves that sat just outside of towns and villages. This work is not so much interested in examining the ways in which people died. Rather, I'm interested in the ways that the living handled the dead and the politics of burying and disposing of the bodies after the famine. What I found through my research was that the bodies played a prominent role in the aftermath of the famine, and they were of significance to both Soviet authorities and to everyday Ukrainians. What to do with the bodies became an act of contestation. For Soviet officials, the bodies counted as evidence. They took extreme measures to remove bodies from villages and towns because visible bodies would implicate the Soviets. However, further insight into the removal practices by the Soviets actually confirms a type of intentionality in regard to the man-made famine, and I'll talk about this more. Although the testimonies seem to indicate that everyone knew what was happening to those who had died, there was also a collective silence. Miss Maria N., a survivor who provided testimony to the CUF, stated that, quote, "the bells did not toll for the dead," end quote. Those responsible for the removal of bodies are often referred to in testimonies as the burial brigades. Those who were part of these brigades were hired hands that were charged with collecting bodies from the street and taking them to graves on the outskirts of cities and villages. Those in this position, almost exclusively done by men, were not allowed to discuss their job, but it is clear that everyone knew what they did. If you read oral testimonies further, these assignments of removing bodies were always oral assignments, they were never written down. The burial brigades would remove bodies using both large trucks and simple peasant carts. The image shown here, which is an artist's rendering of the removal of bodies, shows the cart being pulled by a horse and a man out of the village. People look on in despair as the partly covered bodies are taken to their final resting place. The bodies were taken away from public view and usually thrown into mass graves. Now this is a painting from the collection, the private collection of Morgan Williams, who commissioned some Ukrainian artists to do paintings based on the famine of 32-33. Mr. Mykola Kostirko remembers that, quote, "On the streets, especially on the outskirts of town, lay the bodies of those who died of starvation," end quote. The mass graves were purposely located on the outskirts of town as a way to remove the bodies from sight and away from the ongoings of everyday life. This specifically helped authorities make visible, at least temporarily, any wrongdoing on their behalf. Those who helped collect the bodies were rewarded with bread, a cruel irony considering the presence of mass hunger. An eyewitness to one instance of body collection recalls the disregard the collectors had for the dead. Mr. Alexander Merkalo, whose testimony is found in the CUF's second interim report, stated the following, quote, "I saw how special brigades gathered the corpses from the streets and the houses and carted them to common graves, or simply threw them in ravines. Even the undertakers themselves were half dead," end quote. The removal of bodies took place in both rural and urban settings, and the cities of Kiev and Kharkiv are mentioned repeatedly in survivor testimony. According to witnesses, cities seem to be of more importance to officials than rural villages. Removing bodies from the cities were considered a priority, as the sight of the dead would disrupt the cosmopolitan nature of the cities and could provide counter-evidence to the official Soviet word that there was in fact no starvation in Ukraine. There was also a regular consortium of foreign workers and travelers who passed through the city, especially Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, and we heard about this in the French context yesterday. We know, for example, of the American worker Fred Beal, who was also mentioned yesterday, a labor activist from North Carolina who helped run the Kharkivsky Traktorny Zavod, or the Kharkiv tractor plant. He supervised Russian, Ukrainian, German, and Czech workers at the plant, a truly international operation, and he would later write his book, Proletarian Journey, that would detail his encounter with the famine on the outskirts of Kharkiv. The picture here shows multiple Czechoslovakian women helping with the harvest, an image from a short book that might be less known than his other work, titled Foreign Workers in a Soviet Tractor Plant, which was penned by Beal in 1933. Gives us some insight into the ongoings of the factory and also the silences of the famine that are in the book. This book was also commissioned from Moscow, if that tells you anything. Sources have indicated to us that urban workers were recruited to help with harvest during the famine when collectors were unable to provide the required quotas. This brought in a wide range of workers, many from outside of Ukraine. This was another reason for authorities to dispose of the millions of bodies. According to Mr. Ivan Oransky, a survivor from the Kharkiv area, bodies were, quote, loaded into an ordinary peasant cart hitched to one horse, as though to cover it completely. They were thrown into one common pit. There was not even one grave. The earth was thinly spread out above the so-called burial, end quote. Miss Larysa Donchuk remembers the process in Kharkiv too. She states, quote, in Kharkiv, which was Ukraine's so-called capital, trucks drove around at night and picked up those poor people. The dead and the near dead took them no one knew where, end quote. Miss Donchuk's testimony reveals another clue about the secrecy of the disposal of bodies. According to her, trucks came at night to take away the bodies. This indicates that the process was meant to be conducted in private and away from prying eyes. again adding to the argument that the dead were purposely removed from everyday life. The witnesses that were presented here all make comments on the removal of the dead after the famine, and they are only a select few out of many that provide insight into this topic. The testimonies seem to confirm what other sources have pointed out but did not directly say. For example, we know that death certificates could never indicate that hunger was the cause of death, and you can find these things in the archives, although I have seen some recent ones where Holod was issued as the cause of death. So these are rare, but for the most part, they would not say that hunger was the cause of death. Furthermore, the death records do not give us any insight into where the bodies were kept or disposed of. The limits or silences of these type of archival evidence and sources are one of the many reasons why researchers should turn to the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine and their testimonies. The processes surrounding the disposal of bodies that are discussed in these testimonies are also corroborated by other testimonies that are not part of the CUF archive. In a book compiled by the Ukrainian Youth Association in Great Britain, simply called The Stalin Famine, several references are made to the secretive nature of burying the dead. What's remarkable about the book, beyond the important testimony that it provides, is that it demonstrates that the Soviet practice of disposing of bodies that originated during the famine carried well into the years after the famine was over. By the mid to late 30s, it becomes clear, at least from what we can gather from survivor testimony, that the process of burial went from semi-secret to a full-blown operation of secrecy. One survivor remembers that bodies were removed at night to a special site that was both fenced and guarded. There was a sign on the outside of the fence that read Prombud, which was short for Promyslovo Budivnitstvo, or the industrial construction site. This is what they used to hide what they were doing behind the fence. Once these sites were full of bodies, the mass grave would be filled with dirt on the ground and would be leveled as to hide any traces. However, it did not stop there. After the ground was leveled, authorities would commission the building of parks and recreation areas on top of the mass graves. According to one witness, one site became an exercise field that was used for training by the Red Army. So we literally have the Red Army marching on top of the dead. At the end of the famine, mass graves held anywhere from a few people to hundreds. By this time, cemeteries were completely full, and the mass graves were the quickest way to bury the millions of people who had died. In this picture, you can see another artist's rendition of mass graves. You can see that there are several people in one grave, which is one out of many here. The details of the painting are also important, and one can see the particular emphasis on the death of Ukrainians as indicated by their shirts. There are also other references, folklore, if you pay attention to the birds and other things like this. While some of these graves have been discovered, others have not. In 1939, while building an electrical transformer substation, builders found the earth below the planned construction site to be unstable. Upon further investigation, it was found that the ground below was filled with bodies. There are other instances of mass grave discoveries which were supposedly found in greater mass during the German occupation of Ukraine. Researchers are beginning to uncover more mass grave sites today, and it is possible that one may find it more, or they might find more if they are willing to consult these survivor testimonies. Working with this collection led me to investigate a mass grave site in Lviv. For many of you who have been there, at the Pidzamcha train station, there was a massacre during the 46-47 famine, and several hundred people were killed and thrown into a mass grave on the side of the train, and the city of Lviv decided to build a parking lot over it. The bodies were later exhumed in the early 2000s and moved to the cemetery, but it shows you that these types of things can be hard to discover. So, to conclude, the topic of the burial and removal of bodies is just one theme that appears in the survivor testimonies collected by the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine. The research presented today is but one example of the type of work that can be done with the CUF testimonies, and there are plenty of other histories waiting to be written from this source base. The CUF archive is one of the largest collections of survivor testimony outside of Ukraine, yet researchers have done little to incorporate the testimonies more broadly into their research. Another advantage to this collection is that all of the testimonies in the CUF's 2 interim reports and final reports to Congress are in English. This should open up the study of the Holodomor to students or other new researchers to the topic who are interested but unfamiliar with the Ukrainian or Russian languages. In essence, the archive of the CUF is a good place to start. For those researchers who write regularly on the Holodomor, the CUF may offer new insights into research topics that have yet to be discovered. The more these testimonies are integrated into Holodomor research, the more we will uncover the complex and nuanced narratives of the famine. More importantly, however, these survivor narratives are human narratives. Further use of these sources will emphasize what I believe is a much-needed turn toward the people and individuals who lived through the famine. The narratives told in these testimonies force us to focus on the lived experience, however dire or grim, to broaden our understanding of the famine and its effects. I hope that the evidence presented here today will inspire others to visit the CUF archive and take a look for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I would like to invite Anastasia Leshchyshyn. She is our next presenter. Please.
Hello again. I'll be presenting on a project that HREC is working on with academic librarian Lana Babi to compile an online photo directory of authenticated photos from the Holodomor. So I'll begin by showing a series of 4 photos surreptitiously captured in 1932 in Kharkiv by the Austrian engineer Alexander Wienerberger, who subsequently smuggled the photos out of the Soviet Union. The title of the series, as described by the photographer, is The Tragedy of the Farmer in 4 pictures. So here we have photo 1, photo 2, and the subtitle of this last photo is Released at Last. So until recently, when I had been selecting photos to show at presentations on the directory, I had never been compelled to include these photos. And I think that was largely because of how little I thought they showed relative to other photographs that exist from the famine. Yet I recently realized that these photos demonstrate, maybe more than any others, the invisibility of famine, the prolongation of suffering induced by starvation, the notion of what is seen and what is not seen, and the evident difficulty of capturing famine and starvation in photos. So the photos, you may have deduced, capture the death by starvation of a farmer who would have come to Kharkiv from the countryside searching for food. We know from Wienerberger's diary, the photographer's diary, that the photos were taken over the course of a prolonged 6 days. He kept returning to this location to document the farmer's decline and eventual death. Now, without context, the photo might seem rather uneventful. We can see that the man is suffering, but we see no one in the picture who could bear responsibility for this suffering. There's no tangible weapon that has inflicted any harm, nor could we deduce the prolonged length of time that the series documents. Yet when we multiply this individual experience of suffering by the millions, suddenly we have a substantial phenomenon to consider. So Susan Sontag, an American writer and theorist of photography, wrote in her book Regarding the Pain of Others that photographs of atrocity, quote, bypass disputes about exactly how many were killed. The photograph gives the indelible sample. In preparing the HREC photo directory, a central consideration of ours has been how such a sample, how a photograph can be used to understand broader phenomena and processes of famine and starvation, and in this case to understand the Holodomor. Sontag argues that photos of atrocity will not, quote, repair our ignorance about the history and causes of suffering they pick out and frame. Rather, she says that photographs, quote, cannot be more than an invitation to pay attention, to reflect, to learn, to examine the rationalizations for mass suffering offered by established powers. Who caused what the picture showed? Who is responsible? Is it excusable? Was it inevitable? So Sontag's concept of photos as an invitation to reflect and examine and to illustrate and corroborate other sources is particularly relevant when working with photographs from the Holodomor. And in addition, our understanding of the photographs and the contexts from which they emerged were informed through the consultation of other sources, including archival materials, diaries of the photographers, publications from the 1930s, and criminal case files, which I'll discuss throughout this presentation. So I'll now outline what photos from the Holodomor are available and have been verified. I'll then briefly discuss details concerning the original publication of these photos in the 1930s and aspects that later complicated later efforts to authenticate these photos. And finally, I'll discuss the work being done by Lana Babi and HREC on the photo directory, and we'll show a selection of the photographs that will be included. So there are very few photographs available from the Holodomor during the famine. Any reference to hunger, let alone material photographic evidence, was considered malicious anti-Soviet propaganda. An American photographer, James Abe, whose photographs will be included in the collection, wrote about his experience as a photographer in the Soviet Union during this period, stating that, quote, "Bridges, railway stations, trains, tracks, bread lines, meat lines, any sort of queue for food, all are taboo. The world might jump to the conclusion that proletarian dictatorship is not efficient. Banquet photos are also prohibited. It would never do for starving peasants to run across a shot of Bolshevik officialdom getting a square meal." Now, this scarcity of photos is especially significant when contrasted with the relatively extensive documentation of the famine of the early 1920s in Soviet Ukraine, which followed the period of Russian Revolution and civil wars, and was a result of poor crop yields and excessive grain requisitions by the Bolshevik government. To alleviate the famine, Vladimir Lenin reluctantly allowed the West to aid the starving population, and assistance began arriving in 1921, most notably through the American Relief Administration. Numerous photographs of the famine victims were taken by the foreign aid workers who also documented the relief work that they were conducting. Unfortunately, over the years, authors, filmmakers, even scholars have unwittingly used photos from the 1920s famine, which has been mentioned previously in this conference, as well as other unverified photos depicting starvation, to offer visual concept to their efforts to disseminate the horrors of the Holodomor. So what photos are available? We have three sources for visually documenting the famine. The first category are photographs taken discreetly by non-residents who were usually on official assignment in the Soviet Union, primarily businessmen and representatives of other governments. And these photos were usually smuggled out of the Soviet Union. The second category are photographs taken by local photographers, and a selection of such photos was only recently discovered in the last few years. The final category of photographs are those officially sanctioned by the Soviet authorities, intended for dissemination at home and abroad, which document the implementation of Stalin's communist program. While these photographs don't depict the famine, they do at least illuminate the causes and the mechanisms that contextualized the famine. I note that HREC in our photo directory will only deal with the first two categories. So from these first two categories, only the photos by foreigners were published in the 1930s, appearing first in German language publications out of either Austria or Germany, and in British or US newspapers. Now, I won't go into detail about where these photos were published, although the information will be included in the directory. But I will mention that after their initial publication, these photos became virtually unknown, or their origin became obscured for many decades following the Second World War. And there were several factors concerning the photos' initial publication that complicated future efforts to authenticate the photos. So first, the photos were rarely attributed to their photographers. Publications and their various editions included mixed compilations of photos, including photos from the 1920s famine. Sensationalist reporting cast doubt on the veracity of the photos. There was a general reluctance among the Western press to publish on the famine, which limited the photos' circulation. So beginning in the 1950s, some of the photos began to appear in print and media, but they generally lacked attribution or were misattributed, which fueled accusations of Holodomor deniers that the famine was a right-wing fabrication. It was only in the 1980s that many of the photos were resurfaced and that the process of their authentication began. And since then, photographs of credible provenance have also continued to surface. So the HREC photo directory looks to reconcile all of these efforts of authentication and to serve as a resource for future research. The directory will be the first of its kind, freely accessible and searchable, and intended for scholars, researchers, educators, and the general public. So the subject matter. So as we have in the introduction to our directory, in essence, the subject is anything that the Soviet authorities did not want outsiders to see, as pertains specifically to the implementation and consequences of the Holodomor. This includes any available photographs that illustrate the pervasive deprivation of basic human necessities during this time, pictures that were rarely seen then or now. The geographical area, the initial release of the directory is limited to photographs from Ukraine, as defined by its political boundaries in the early 1930s. And the exception to this is the selection of photographs from the 1920s famine in Russia and Ukraine. So there are no anonymous photographs included among the Holodomor collections, or among the collections in the directory. Any doubtful photographs in terms of attribution, date, or country are not included. At least in this first version, and Lana Babi has done most of the painstaking work involved in authenticating these photos. So our collections. So at this point we have 5 collections. 3 relate to photos taken by foreigners. So the Austrian Alexander Wienerberger, whose photos I showed, and 2 Americans, James Abe and Whiting Williams. One of the collections relates to a local resident of Ukraine, Mykola Bokan, and the 5th is the collection of 1920s photos that we are including that are frequently misattributed, and we're including this so as to prevent, or to offer a resource to prevent the use of these photos in future in relation to the Holodomor. So HREC has recently partnered with an organization called Our Digital World in Toronto, who specialize in collaborations with libraries, archives, and museums to create digital collections of their materials. And the online tool that they have created and that is being further developed to cater to the needs of our collections has an array of search functionalities available in Cyrillic and Latin script, and we're quite thrilled to be working with them on this project. So here is an example of what a photo entry will look like in our directory, at least a draft version of this. So we'll have standard information included related to the name of the photographer, the date, location of the photos. There will also be a link we will be including in the directory, biographies of the photographers. We'll have a description of the photo that both describes what is in the photo and offers some context for the photos themselves. We'll also include multiple versions of the photos. I mentioned that they were published in various sources in the 1930s, and we are including a field photo history until 1939. We're not doing a photo history throughout the last century, or since the Holodomor, just in the 1930s, and will include the citation of those original publications. Will show how those photos were included. Sometimes they were cropped differently, or they were zoomed in. Sometimes they had different captions, and we're going to include all of that in the directory as well. And of course, the copyright information will be included. So today I'll offer a glimpse into some of these collections, notably the photos of more photos of Alexander Wienerberger, and those of the local photographer Mykola Bokan. So Wienerberger's photos are the most well-known published in this period. And Wienerberger worked in the industrial sector in Kharkiv, which was then the capital of Soviet Ukraine, and in 1933 he took a series of photos in Kharkiv and the vicinity, and these photos document life in and around the city, showing the effects of the famine both on the destitute city residents and on the starving and dying refugees from the devastated rural areas. The photos were smuggled through diplomatic mail, and upon his return to Austria, Wienerberger allowed his photographs to be used in various anti-Bolshevik publications and to support an international campaign for famine relief. Wienerberger also compiled an album of 25 photos, which he gifted to Cardinal Theodor Initzer, the Roman Archbishop of Vienna, as a token of appreciation for his efforts to organize a relief campaign that ultimately was unsuccessful. This album, which has photos attributed to Wienerberger, was kept in the diocesan archive in Vienna and was resurfaced again only in the 1980s. And so we have photos here. So we have the tragic famine in South Russia. This is the cover of the album. So here's one photo This is from the album, and I wanted to show how the photos in different instances and different publications were cropped differently, had different captions attributed to them. So this again was from the album, and we have a caption inscribed by Wienerberger, "In Agony." The photo then also appeared in another album of Wienerberger's with the caption, "Starvation." And the final one was published in the book by Amende and Wienerberger, "Muss Russland hungern?" And it had a caption, "The jaded population has lost in interest in the gruesome sight of people dying of starvation." So you'll notice that in each of these versions, we get a slightly broader view of what is included in the photo, which is why we're including these multiple versions in each of the entries. So here is a selection of other photos. So Wienerberger took very few posed photos. They're mostly snapshots that document the endless lines for food, empty storefronts, the utterly destitute and homeless from the villages, and the dead and dying in the streets of Kharkiv. We have child of workers from Kharkiv, lice-ridden candidates for death in the avenues, on the streets. So the next collection I will speak about is by, very few photos offer evidence of famine that were taken by private citizens of the Soviet Union, or Soviet Ukraine. Only in the last few years, photos were discovered in the archives of the Security Service of Ukraine, in the criminal case file of Mykola Bokan, a resident of Baturin in Chernihiv province. The case file includes photos from Bokan's life, from all of Bokan's life, not only from the famine. It includes paperwork related to his case, interview reports with witnesses, including some of his children and family members and friends, a draft of Bokan's memoir written in the mid-1930s, and several of Bokan's correspondences. I note that HREC was fortunate to obtain scans of the hundreds of items in his file from the producer Andriy Tkach, and that Daria Glaskova, a HREC work study student in Toronto, has been especially helpful in sorting through all of these files. So Bokan, we know from the file, was a self-employed photographer. Based on information, we know that local townspeople would hire him for his services, and that he had materials to produce photographs in his home. What we know about the Bokan family's experience of famine is documented both in his memoir and in the haunting images captured by Bokan of his family's suffering, which notably includes documentation of the death of one of his sons from starvation. Now, the photos that we have for the file appear in two formats. The one format is single photographs, and the second is a photo display board, both of which offer different insight about the photos and the context from which they emerged. And these two different formats have led to, which I will show, led to a different approach to this particular collection in this directory. So here is one single photo. This is an example. And in his memoir, Bokan mentions that some of his family members had begun to swell from hunger already in 1932. And here's a photo from 1933 of Bokan's family with the caption, 300 days, 300, without a piece of bread for a hungry meal. Now, the display boards I mentioned look like something like this. So in the case file, we have both a single separate photo about this size, and then we have these display boards, and you'll notice that the photo that I just showed appears in the bottom, and there's also an additional caption listed on the right-hand side. We also then have in his memoir a reference, and again, this is a draft of a memoir. It's apparent that he wrote this in the mid-1930s, and there's reference to this photo as well. Some of the earlier entries in the memoir actually have photos. You'll notice here that there are blank spaces that are numbered. They're filled in earlier in the memoir. Evidently, he didn't get to inserting the photos here. But here, so we also have related to this photo a journal entry, 300 days with no bread, with no piece of bread. And now he says, so this was a year later, now it's been 600 days. And it seems to me that it won't be any time soon that a working person will have bread on their table. We eat it with small portions as a delicacy on holidays. So I spoke earlier in this presentation about the prolongation of suffering, and all of these both these photos and the journal entry really provide insight into the kind of prolonged suffering that this family experienced. So in 1933, actually even beginning in 1932, the family was no longer able to sustain themselves. There were about 6 or 7 children in the family at that point. Some had already left the home. Bukan encouraged one of his elder sons, Kostya, to take on work on a collective farm where it was hoped he would be fed. I note that one of Kostya's older brothers, Vladimir, a year earlier had been forced to leave home as the family could not sustain everyone. And apparently on several occasions, Vladimir vandalized his parents' home out of anger for the situation. Bukan claims that Kostya similarly turned hostile towards his father. And according to Bukan, the collective farm workers were fed inadequately, in some instances only receiving cigarettes for breakfast. So underfed and overworked, Kostya died from exhaustion and starvation. And we have some photos here documenting this. So here we have the place where Kostya died. On the left sits his brother, who is speaking to him here 2 hours before Kostya's death. Another photo of Kostya Bukan's grave. He died 30th of June 1933 in the field from hard labor on the collective farm and malnutrition. We also then have remembering Kostya, who died from hunger. So there's Bukan on the right-hand side and 3 of his other sons. And I know you notice a photo display board featured in this photograph. We don't have this particular display board about Kostya's death in the archive. The only evidence that we have of the existence of this particular board is from this photo. So I also note that some photos only appeared in these display board. We didn't have, and and the display boards are also very small. So we've had to do a lot of zooming in order to see what's been included and what kind of inscriptions are attributed to each of these photos. So just recently, in the last few weeks, we discovered some additional photos related to the famine that we hadn't previously seen. So in particular, we have this, and that make more sense to us as well as we've gone through Bukan's memoir and other aspects of the file. So here is a photo Kostya's with the inscription, Kostya's farewell dinner on the occasion of his departure for a separate residency. And in his journal, Bukan also included a quote that we didn't know. We knew he was leaving our house. We didn't know he was also leaving for his death. We then have a picture of Bukan, of the son Kostya Bukan in his grave. And we also just recently, again zooming in, and we will get better qualities of these photos from the archive as well, of Kostya's funeral. So this was a recent discovery. So in 1937, Bukan was arrested for his involvement in anti-Soviet and counter-revolutionary propaganda, and for the dissemination of photos of, quote, a provocative character. And the Chernihiv provincial court sent him to jail for 8 years, and he died in a concentration camp a few years later. Well, I also include here one more photo. It's another photo display board showing the Bukan family, which says, a family, one of many in the world, suffering senselessly. And the little inscriptions across some of the family members' photos show how they either died or left. Kostya is mentioned there as dying from death. There was also a lot of tension within the Bukan family, induced both by the circumstances of the famine, but also induced by Mykola Bukan's involvement in the Tolstoyan movement, and he had particularly strong religious views that often put him, caused him to butt heads with a lot of his children. And so there are a lot of dynamics also at play here aside from the famine. But what I wanted to show with this photo is how we will be including in the directory these display boards, and we'll be including both the original Russian translations, the original Russian inscriptions, the English translation of the inscriptions, and we'll be providing these sort of textual maps. Again, they'll be digitized. We're only at the stage of these handwritten ones, so that people in navigating these photos will be able to understand what text belongs to what and what inscriptions are offered on all of these boards. Okay, so to conclude, while the provenance of these particular photos is no longer in question, And while they do depict extreme suffering, they don't necessarily depict famine, or at least not in the kind of way that we see in the 1920s photographs of bloated bodies or emaciated bodies. And also a number of, all of the photos that we have in this collection are taken in urban areas, and we don't have photos from the rural areas of Ukraine. But what these photos do is help us to attempt to visualize the invisibility of famine, to understand the prolongation of suffering, of starvation, and they serve to illustrate and corroborate other documentation of the famine, and they help us construct, revise, and understand the complex realities from which they emerged. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. I hope that soon a lot of researchers will use the opportunity to work with this photo directory. And I would like to invite Larysa Zasiekina from National University of Ostroh and Anglia Ruskin University. Please welcome.
Thank you for an opportunity to present our research and demonstrate our clinical psychological perspective to the famine 1932-1933. And today today the world begins to recognize the famine as a genocide. And during these days, these 2 days, we emphasize that one of the primary tasks of our conference is to realize how the world understands the Holodomor. But I think the not less important is to understand how we comprehend the Holodomor. And it's very important to realize how we understand the consequences of the Holodomor on the future generations, on us in Ukraine. So, on the way we approach our understanding of the Holodomor, we shift the focus from the famine 1932-1933 as historical event to the Holodomor as complex mental trauma. In our research, Holodomor is used as trauma, and we can see that there are different types of mental trauma. And we can see also that the Holodomor belongs to each kind, to each type of this trauma. Of course, it is individual and collective trauma because it refers to each concrete individual, to the family, and to the community. Of course, it is identity trauma because it refers to the identity group characteristics. And we know that the Holodomor was aimed not at the physical abolishment of people, not only at the physical abolishment, but the abolishment of national culture and national identity. And we know that we have problems with national identity in Ukraine even now. We don't know what language we are speaking, we do not know what church we are visiting, we do not know what values we are appreciating. So probably the famine is one of the reasons why the national identity is Ukraine is underdeveloped even now. So of course, it is historical trauma, and we were speaking yesterday and today that the Holodomor refers to the concrete historical period of Soviet Union, to the concrete historical events like collectivization, industrialization, and so on. And recent research shows that collective trauma has intergenerational nature. It means that there are some mechanisms which transmit mental trauma from one generation to another one. And from this perspective, the Holodomor is very important because it influences the Ukrainians and well-being and quality of life of Ukrainians nowadays. And there are some researchers which compare the Holodomor with different genocides in terms of intergenerational trauma effects. And we can see that it compared with Holocaust, and the research shows that the descendants of Holocaust have some personality traits as anger, they have anxiety, and they have some vulnerability to PTSD and some psychiatric disorders. In Armenian genocides, we can see that direct descendants have some tendency to ethnic-related shame. In Native Americans and Canadian Aborigines studies, we can see that they have some tendency to suicidal thoughts and suicides. And also there are some recent research which shows similarity between the Holodomor and the Great Irish Famine. And from psychological perspective, the most interesting fact that Irish famine was well documented on the society level, but was not documented on personal level. So we do not know personal attitudes to the famine in Ireland. While in Holodomor, we know a lot of feelings and experience of people, because we have a lot of videotyped and transcribed interviews, and we had opportunity to watch and to listen to them yesterday and today. There are two ways of genocide: the ethnic cleansing and starvation, and also we can see that the Holodomor belongs to all these types. So it was conducted by starvation, and it was aimed at ethnic cleansing as well. And the recent research shows that there is some survivor mode of people who experienced mental trauma and Holodomor. And we have some research which show that the survivors and direct descendants, 3 generations of descendants of survivors of Holodomor, have some specific emotional states and some specific behavioral strategies. And we can see that these descendants have some vulnerability to anxiety, to stress, to anger, to ethnic-related shame. And we can see some coping strategies which are linked to food, to overeating, to some selfishness, to indifference to others. So we can say that trauma-based coping strategies are caused by a strong fear of possible reoccurrence of hunger in future and seeking security linked to food. Considering the policy of silence of the Soviet Union and some periods of independence in Ukraine, because we know that only Yushchenko and Poroshenko initiate the recognition of the Holodomor as genocide. So these periods, different periods in the Soviet Union and independent Ukraine, attempted to conceal the truth of these tragic events. So it's very important to investigate the Holodomor on 3 levels: on individual, family, and society level. And the aim of our research is to investigate the Holodomor's mental trauma on all these 3 levels. And society level, we the research of mental trauma on society level was conducted on the basis of archives collections, and the family and individual level was this research was conducted on the personal interviews. And we recruited 25 survivors of the famine 1932-1933 in Ukraine, and for semi-structural interviews. The research took place in 2005 to 2003-2005, and the participants and the researcher have not been acquainted before. And the inclusion criteria for participants were their personal history of being Holodomor survivors. And Holodomor survivor is defined as a person who witnessed these tragic events and belonged to the family which experienced hunger in 1932-1933. And the participants were representatives of different regions in Ukraine. And according to the age, we can see that when these events occurred, their age was about 7-8 years old. And we know from clinical psychology that when trauma occurs in the childhood, it has very poor impact on mental health of these people. And the study explores the collective memory based on the archives collection from UK Web Archives, and the archives collection are presented in English, and the personal interviews were collected in Ukrainian. And it was very important to find methodology, and the methodology was represented by the grounded theory, and the grounded theory includes 3 main steps or aspects. So the choosing of the main situations in our research, they were represented by subjects or actors or agents. Then the second, descriptive categories, so the actions of these subjects. And we used propositions, so we collected all propositions which are performed or referred to each of these agents or subjects. And then we generalize all descriptive categories into wider categories, and we got conceptual categories. And for analysis of personal interview, we used Ukrainian version of LUK, Linguistic Inventory Word Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, which was introduced by Penny Baker, professor of Ostroh University. And this software tool helped us to define linguistic markers, different parts of speech, and psychological categories, which were widely expressed in the personal interviews. And methodology was very important because I was always, I was often asked, I am a direct descendant of the Holodomor survivor. I represent the 2nd generation, and I am often asked, is it possible to forgive or forget, or how to avoid bias investigating the Holodomor? And my answer is always that I try to investigate this problem from the stance of human rights. And I try to select and to design very strict methodology to investigate these issues in order to be objective. And the table 1 represents the samples, how we collected, how we analyzed these archives, and how we selected the subjects, then propositions, the 2nd category, and the last one, the conceptual categories. And you can see that the most widespread categories in these documents are represented by subjects: Stalin, party officials, regular troops. We were listening we heard yesterday that they were called brigadas, and persons and NKVD. And as for conceptual categories, we can see that Stalin is accompanied with such categories like forced collectivization, crash of Ukrainian nationalism, raise of grain procurement quotas, condemned of peasants to death from starvation. As party officials and regular troops is characterized by such conceptual categories as war of attrition against peasants, demonstrating power, execution and deportation. For peasants, the categories are resistance and sufferings, for NKVD policy against peasants, and so on. So we try to choose all main categories, descriptive and then more wide categories, conceptual categories, in order to catch the main themes and topics of the archives collection. And another part of our research is connected with personal interviews, and which were analyzed by software program LUK. And we can see the results in the table. In the first column, you can see the results of natural speech, so it's normal indices for natural speech, and in the second column the indices from personal interviews from survivors of the Holodomor. And we can see the increased frequency of pronouns we and I, and the frequency of these pronouns is increased in narratives when the individual is a victim of the event. The interesting finding is the higher frequency of the pronoun we comparatively with I. It could be linked to viewing the Holodomor as a great collective tragedy. It is in line with the high frequency of the category family, you can see in the table, and therefore the collective tragedy refers to the family experience rather than community feelings, because community is not represented in the speech at all. So it is in line with the previous research about selfishness and indifference towards others. And for example, when I was working in Sderot, the most in Israel, the most work with PSD is linked to a community, to work with community, and all treatment and prevention of PSD is based on the work with community. And we can see that in Holocaust this category is absent. The whole community for the individuals, the survivors of Holodomor, is their family. And then we can see that the most frequent words in the category of family are mother, sister, and grandmother. So we can see that Holodomor has female face, and it is in line, it is consistent with the high frequency of female references in the category of female references in the interviews, and the predominance of the third pronoun singular she. However, this finding could be explained by the fact that females constitute the majority of the sample in our research. Another important finding of the research is that the categories of effects and negative emotions are not widespread in the interviews. It is inconsistent with the previous research that Holodomor survivors express great fear, anger, and sadness towards the events. So we can say that the Holodomor survivors demonstrate avoidance of recollecting feelings towards these events which they experienced, and probably they want to avoid physical and emotional pain linked to their traumatic memory. This behavior is one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorders, and this assumption is also strengthened by another finding of low frequency of the category of time. Traumatic memory accompanied by PTSD is characterized by loss of time, the absence of border between past and present. So we can assume that survivors have some symptoms of PTSD. The results of the research indicate that the Holodomor survivors use more death-related words and do not link the tragic events to religious issues. It's a bit strange for us, again, if compare it to Irish famine. The main features of the in the island and in survivors and indirect descendants, that they experience the mixed feelings of providentialism. So the feelings that it's God's punishment, and we can see that in the Ukrainian community there is no religious category, and it is interesting result as for us. And of course, there are some limitations of our research. The small sample size did not allow us to explore the impact of demographic characteristics and impact on the feelings and emotions of thoughts and the experience of survivors. We also did not use standardized measure to assess PTSD. Therefore, we can make only the preliminary conclusion about PTSD symptoms in survivors. But we continue to study vulnerability to PTSD and continuous traumatic stress in people who live now in the eastern part of Ukraine, so indirect descendants of the Holodomor survivors. Our research has an important theoretical and practical issue because conceptualizing a collective, individual, and family memory based on archives and personal interviews leads to overcoming gaps in recollecting the famine in 1932-1933 in Ukraine and suggests clinical psychological perspective. We also want to acknowledge the team of translators who translated the Luke 2015 dictionary, its Ukrainian version of this dictionary, since a considerable part of this research was possible due to the release of the Ukrainian version of this program. Thank you for attention.
Thank you a lot, Larysa. And our last participant and speaker for today, Olga Klymenko, with her paper about the Maniak Collection. Please, welcome.
So in the last 6 months, I worked with preparing for publishing over 100 testimonies, unpublished testimonies, reading them, editing the transcripts or preparing the transcripts, choosing which ones to translate and editing translations. So it's very much kind of raw research and thinking through working on the material. What is the best way to present the material? How to capture the content so that it is respectful of the source, but it's also usable scientifically, let's say. So in this presentation, I would like to address the questions of the provenance of the collection, some technical aspects of working with the collection. I'll present some numbers that, you know, at this point I kind of extracted from the material that I worked with, and what is in the collection, what types of the account, what are the prominent themes. Then I'll try to provide my perspective on the significance of a collection as a whole, what other themes can be there except Holodomor, or what it adds to our existing knowledge about Holodomor. And hopefully I will have time and I'll provide maybe some examples of how I use keywords, or what kind of subjects I'm trying to devise based on the content on the collection, and maybe show some examples how I use it in a particular, in case of particular testimonies that bring a lot of topics together. So, what is the Maniak Collection? It's a collection of testimonies about the 1932-33 famine, a topic which used to be a taboo in the Soviet Union until the late 1980s. They were collected from the general public. Those were letters written in late 1988, mid-1989, in response to a call to submit personal accounts of the 1932-33 famine to create a people's memorial to the famine. Volodymyr Maniak was an author, journalist, member of the Writers' Union of Ukraine, and he was one of the leaders of the Memorial Association of Ukraine. And Lydia Kovalenko-Maniak was his spouse. She was an editor, journalist, activist, and she was the first head of the Holodomor Researcher Association. So they were very much writers and activists rather than historians. So for them it was kind of a historical but an ethical endeavor. So both Maniak and Kovalenko were instrumental in collecting the accounts and spearheading the creation of the groundbreaking book 33 Голод, Народна книга Memorial, The Famine of 33, a People's Memorial Book, which was published in 1991. So Maniak's interest in famine came from his family background. His father was some Soviet functionary before the war. He was in the partisans, Soviet partisans, and he somehow died, so he wanted to investigate the circumstances of his death. And in the 80s, he published several documentary novels based on war-time themes and co-edited a collection, Wreath of Eternity, Venok Besmertya. It was a memorial book chronicling the history of Ukrainian villages which has suffered punitive retribution during the Second World War at the hands of the Nazis. But he also learned that the Soviet version of what was going on during the war, it was not really, you know, accurate, to say the least. And also, while collecting the testimonies about the burnt villages, he realized that the 1933 famine was an equally or even a more burning issue for a lot of people in the villages. So he wanted to gather the survivors' account while the witnesses were still alive and to learn what they have to say about the causes and consequences of the greatest crime of Stalinism, which was his definition of what it was, in their own words. In their own words. So the first call was placed in Literaturna Gazeta, which was a newspaper of the Writers' Union of Ukraine. It was number 45 in 1988, based on some letters. It's not dated, what I have here. Sorry. Okay. Forgot about my presentation. I got carried away. So the Writers' Union of Ukraine supported the Maniak's effort. So the first call was placed in this newspaper, which was the newspaper of the Writers' Union of Ukraine by Yevhen Hutsala, but it was of a very general nature, very cautious, very reflective. As you know, like in New York, they showed the documentary about the famine. And, you know, can you imagine a documentary about the famine appearing in Ukraine now? So, you know, we discussed at the Writers' Union this idea of creating a people's memorial book about famine, and then we got some response. So I think it's time to place a general call. So that was in Literaturna Ukraina. So the bottom part of the same page was also interesting, because there a teacher from Cherkasy Oblast was saying that, you know, the official version of events of famine, the blameless version of events, is not really, you know, appropriate for this time. So why the scholars and writers are afraid to talk openly about the famine in Ukraine in 1988. So my perception is like, you know, even the Writers' Union couldn't be straight with what they wanted to say, so they had to use the account from a teacher to basically formulate what the problem was. So the next call was placed in Leshchyshyn on December 9, 1988. Why is Leshchyshyn? If you look at the bottom of the scan, you will see that the newspaper was the highest circulation at the time in Ukraine. It was 2.2 million copies. So it was the highest circulation for this particular newspaper, and it was the newspaper with the highest circulation. And of course, Leshchyshyn, people read Leshchyshyn in provinces and villages, so it was a very smart strategy to place it there. And the call was actually signed by Professor Kulchitsky. It was inviting to contribute to the People's Memorial of Famine. And basically it was saying that there is a editing board created of writers and scholars. Maniak was the editor-in-chief, and they intended to publish the testimonies of participants and witnesses of those events, archival materials, documents, and press materials. So it was kind of intended as a mixture of documentary material and personal testimonies. And the call basically notes that publishing the official documents was not enough, as they never provided the honest information about the condition of the peasants or even mentioned the famine. The memorial book, therefore, will rely mostly on eyewitness accounts, and it was a call for people to submit their contributions, and the letters were to be sent to the editorial board of the Leshchyshyn or to Maniak's home address. So early responses are published as early as January 3rd, so it's less than a month. And you could see that it's close to 24 responses. And so Leshchyshyn reported on the progress of the campaign, and the letters were coming not only from Ukraine, that was also mentioned in these publications. And some of the responses were sent in response to a call on the radio. I suspect it was probably somebody from the Writers' Union, but it's more difficult to trace. And also some were sent to the Union of Writers and to the editorial board of Literaturna Ukraina. So in July of 1989, Maniak writes this, large article, Reflections on the Manuscript of the Memorial Book of Famine of 1933. So basically, he reports it is completed, it's ready for publishing. So they work very fast. They were motivated by the fact that, it was 88 and not so many survivors are remaining. And, they wanted to kind of present this first version of the people's history of famine to the public. So here are some of the quotations, how Maniak described the book in his own words. So it's a fulfillment of the debt to the memory of millions of compatriots killed by Stalin, a farewell to fear implanted into the peasants' mind by Stalinist famine and total collectivization. And it is a sign of new age. History returns to the people and truth returns to the history. So in the book portrays antiquated past as it was in real life. So it's like very much like in the tradition of Franke, Hrushevsky, and people's history of Ukraine. So the book and the letters. The book was the first major attempt in Ukraine to collect personal accounts of famine. It gave the voice to the people. It was an act of symbolic justice. It represents still the book, the important primary source for Holodomor research. It is a notable achievement of the nascent Ukrainian civil society to raise the Holodomor issue as a public issue. So as I mentioned, the manuscript was ready for publication in mid-1989. But the Maniak Kovalenko work appeared only in the latter part of 1991, after Ukraine's declaration of independence. So you can see there was almost 2 years between it was published. So there are kind of different explanations for that. Overall, Maniak and Kovalenko received 6,000 letters. The memorial book used approximately 1,000 abridged letters. They were edited for language and not included in the entirety. And the letters were never archived systematically. In the early 1990s, Maniak and Kovalenko passed on some unpublished letters, about 700, and the copy of the manuscript of the book, it was because of the August 1990 putsch, to Volodymyr Boychuk, a French-Ukrainian colleague. They intended to pass on to him the remaining letters to ensure that those letters will get published abroad in case it wouldn't be possible to accomplish in Ukraine. Maniak died in June of 1992 in a bizarre vehicle accident. They were attending with a group of people, the activists of the Memorial Society and some writers, the reveal of the first monument to the victims of Holodomor somewhere in Kyiv Oblast. And on the way back, the bus was hit by a truck and 13 people were killed. So the help was late. So basically, Maniak died while waiting for medical help. Lydia Kovalenko kind of took over what he was doing, and she was the first head of the Holodomor Researchers Association, but she died not long after him, like in 6 months. So basically, what happened with the remaining collection is largely unknown, but HREC is currently in possession of the electronic copies of close to 600 letters from the Maniak Collection, and HREC's Associate Director for Publications, Andriy Makuch, was a lead on Maniak Collection project in 2013-2018. He was the one who got in touch with Boychuk and facilitated the transfer of the electronic files with the letters to HREC. And sadly, Andriy passed away in January of this year. So I kind of took over the project in March. So here are some numbers. On the left, my left, is the letters Andriy prepared for publication online, posting online on our website. 97 letters. These are scans of the original letters with or without envelope. Transcriptions for each letter, and selection of translated letters. Now we have 18, maybe we'll add a few. You see some statistics, mostly they're from Ukraine, languages predominantly Ukrainian, 90%, and here is the location of events, but at the time, like the location was tagged based on contemporary oblasts. So in 2009, these are the letters that I worked with Again, it's transcriptions and translations sent from Ukraine, most of them 110. Again, about 90% are written in Ukrainian. Location of events, I am tagging, in addition to contemporary location, what it was in 1932-33, which is in itself an interesting task because the boundaries of rayons changed, the oblasts, you know, they were like 2 years, there were these oblasts, and there were other oblasts, so at the time it was 5 oblasts, and autonomous Moldovan Soviet Socialist Republic, Baltsky Rayon, which is currently Odessa. And there are 3 letters with unknown location. Because I kind of felt, you know, we have a large sample, what do we do with it? So I started like a spreadsheet. I started entering the information, deciding which information to enter in which form. So one of the kind of pieces of information is the age. And then if you look at it, 64% of the letters written by the people born between 1917 and 1926, which means that people were 6 to 16 at the time of the famine. And yeah, like in general, letters were sent by people who were born between 1904 and 1939 for those letters for which the date of birth was given. Okay, so where I'm going with this? So some technical aspects. So we have a large number of testimonies written at the same time in response to the same call. The limitations of what we already posted online for different reasons is limited searchability. They're uploaded as files. And there is no keyword or subject search. So what I wanted to accomplish, and like what we collectively decided to try and accomplish, create a database, devise and refine keywords and subjects to better capture the content in this specific collection. So I started like, I'm describing what is in the testimony rather than I read what other people, what are the terms that people devise, right? And then we'll see what we can do with this, how we can connect it to other databases, to other materials out there. So it's, you know, like find the way to bridge the qualitative, the thick description, and the richness of the individual accounts, and given the size of the sample, to gauge the occurrence of certain events, patterns of behavior, and look for something that we can make quantifiable. But again, you know, like when you read these testimonies, each of them is so precious. So again, in a respectful way. So Anastasia mentioned collaboration with our digital world. So what they will help to do is to increase searchability and discovery and improve end user experience. But in practical terms, it would mean that you will be able to browse by location, events, last name. We will be able to tag multi-locations. So basically, if a testimony is in several locations, we attach all the locations tagged to them. And again, we can, you know, tag the location in 1932-33 and what it is now, because, for instance, there was no Cherkasy Oblast in 1932-33, and a lot of accounts are from Cherkasy Oblast. So, you know, there was no Chernihiv Oblast, and there is Chernihiv Oblast, and a lot of things happened between that. And in some cases, however hard you try, you cannot really find in which rayon the village was at the time, because the boundaries of rayons were often switching even more than the boundaries of oblasts. Okay. Here, I want to address it really briefly. So in the original call placed in Selsky, there was a specific set of questions which was asked of the respondents. So it was questions about the sabotage of the grain procurement by the party workers and the economic functionaries, gospodarniki, repressions of the leaders and the rank and file members of the collective farms for their arrears and grain requisitioning, forms of the centralized help to the starving on the Republican, Oblast, Rayon, and local collective farm level, the fate of the villages posted on the blackboard, number of those who died of famine in villages held by the city in spring sowing campaign, and just the recollections of one witnesses. So this is just one of the ways to look at it, because there is so much, and you know, like how do we organize it? So to me, what was interesting is what kind of questions were not addressed at all in the testimony. So hardly any letter mentions sabotage of the grain procurement by the party, village council, and kolhosp leaders. So the accusation in sabotage is usually perceived by those who write as a result of some gesture of compassion towards the people. For instance, in one account, father was stripped of his candidacy for membership in the Communist Party for refusing to take away all grain and food from the collective forum members, leaving some for their children. Or in another account, in the summer of 1933, a head of the collective farm airs an idea about grinding some grain and giving it to people so that they can, you know, survive somehow and to be able to gather the harvest. So it was in the evening, and by the morning he was gone. Someone reported and he was taken away. So in people's account, there is no actual saboteurs. So saboteurs are those people who are, you know, trying to be nice to people and then they're being punished. And no one also mentions there is nothing about the blackboarded villages. I don't say that there would be nothing in the remaining 400 letters, and we do not really know in which order they were scanned and why they're organized the way they're organized. We're just taking, you know, like each folder now and looking what is in each folder. So maybe, you know, we have half of those who were criticizing, criticizing the regime, but saying that it was very good. Actually, I saw only one account like that, where they were saying, you know, like collective farms were good, and actually everything was not so bad. And now there is like it's the creation of the new cult of personality. All these accounts that, you know, the famine was organized by the party. Most of accounts are not like that. So no one also mentions any centralized help that came from outside of the village. No grain or food, no help from the city with the spring sowing campaign or harvesting. And two letters mentioned visits by the Republican officials that made no difference at all. For instance, one was, I believe, in Pyretin, and he said, oh, there was first Postyshev, then Petrovsky, and there was grain sitting in the station, and they did absolutely nothing. So issues in the call, mentioned in the call and addressed in the letters. So the ones that I highlighted in yellow, these are some of the kind of keywords that I'm using now to describe this, you know, events and issues. So repression of the leaders and rank and file kolkhoz members for their arrears in grain requisitioning. This features prominently. Most letters describe in various degree of detail the requisitioning of all grain, seeds, food, and goods. Quite a few dispossession total of their families. They were thrown out of their houses. Everything was taken from them. And it is impressive that even 5 decades later, people could correctly recall everything that was taken from them and their families. Sometimes they can write it in 2 pages. And persecution, repressions, family members, people they knew were arrested, put on trial, deported, or sent to labor camps. Often they use the phrase, they never returned. Some respondents have never learned what happened to their relatives after they were taken away. Widespread abuse of power, harassment by activists and the search brigades or the procurement commissars, uповноважених, use of deception to extract more money or grain, mechanisms of extraction, certificates, taking away the grain brought to the mill, cows taking away things stolen during the search, excessive use of violence, humiliation, use of torture. For instance, heads of peasant households were detained in the buildings of the village council and beaten, tortured for arrears. And the other issue which was mentioned in the original call, and you know, it's kind of logical that it's there, it's the mortality estimates the best people could, because it was supposed to be the memorial book. So I use the terms mass mortality and major family mortality, because these are usually the themes more prominent in those accounts. So what issues are important to the respondents? Of course, it's kind of perception, but you know, you can kind of, I'm making a judgment call that was important to them. Naming the victims, telling the tragedy of their family, neighbors, friends, and villages, making sure that their names will appear in the memorial book and will not be forgotten. Naming the perpetrators. Perpetrators are compared to the Nazis, to Hitlerites, to Janissary, to Maoists. Stalin is called the devil and King Herod. Their crimes are crimes against humanity, and perpetrators turned collaborators or executed by the Nazis are often mentioned in the accounts. So demanding that the perpetrators are brought to justice, asking why their letters with the names of the perpetrators was not published. So like you have a woman who is like, I saw the account of somebody else and you published it and mine, and I named all these people who still live in the village, they gave us hard time, why didn't you publish it? So people follow up, they want to know that there will be justice. And there was a letter about Kaganovich, it's not from this batch, from the next batch. The guy writes and says, you know, you published something saying that Kaganovich is a criminal. So this is the letter I sent to the prosecutor's office in Shevchenkivsky Rayon in Kiev, asking when there will be the trial of Kaganovich, because he is still alive and I can give you his address. So people were willing to donate money to a memorial, the importance of commemoration. So they see it like as a symbolic justice and as a lesson for the future. And then a lot of people draw a link between perestroika and Stalinist crimes. Those who oppose perestroika are construed as the same people who committed crimes during the famine. Only those who did not live through the famine can say anything good about Stalin. So this is the perception. Here is just my general ideas about why the collection is interesting, special. So these are unabridged and unedited accounts, because in the book we know they were edited. So you have an envelope, you can see usually, in some cases, the envelope on both sides. In many cases, it's just the face. For some reason, somebody was scanning only the face, but sometimes you can see the exact date when it was sent. Some interesting things, for instance, the envelope is signed in Russian and the letter inside in Ukrainian. I think it's interesting. Or some people write detailed accounts and they never provide the return address. So the testimonies are open-ended. So people wrote what they considered necessary and in their own words, even though they were given some general instructions. So in a way, maybe it's more difficult to, you know, categorize, but it has the richness that probably the structured interviews wouldn't have in certain aspects. The language. Most letters are written by semi-literate people in vernacular language. I mean, we can say they use Surzhyk, but in actuality, this is the language they spoke, so who were to decide if this is Surzhyk or not. So they also apologize profusely about being semi-literate. Close to 90% of the letters are in Ukrainian. So I don't know, what do we make of it? Is it largely the marker of the peasantry, or another idea I have now, there was also a Russian language version of Selsky Visti, and I kind of figured it out recently. That's something to look at. Some respondents had never written a letter before. So to me, it's a testimony to the urgency and relevance of the issue. Some inquire if their letter was received, why it was not published, ask for instructions how to write the response correctly to make sure it gets published. So to me, it's kind of relatively uncontaminated account, because you see that those people, like, I mean, maybe they read Selsky Visti, or maybe somebody else reads Selsky Visti for them or told them about this. So I think that lack of public information and public discussion at the time leads me to conclusion that these people were not kind of, you know, they heard something and tell something. They write only their own experiences and in the words that are accessible to them. So we have, oh my God, 2 more minutes. The variety, types of letters, very general, just a few words, very detailed about famine or one of the aspects. Unique individual accounts, family sagas, urban, letters with newspaper clippings, letters from the local activists, Bellatrides accounts. I told you about the envelopes, and so basically at large, it's a rich material from the history from below, gives the voice of silent majority. So it places the famine in a long-term perspective and demonstrates its lasting effects. You can see people kind of start with sometimes they start with the revolution, sometimes they start with NEP and say, this is how we lived during NEP. We were not rich, but we, you know, like it was decent life. And then started the decolonization, then there was a famine, and we never really recovered, because even in 1934, they imposed all kinds of taxes on us, and, you know, like I have to, whatever I grew in my garden, I had to take to the market and sell to pay the taxes, and many other things. It portrays a catastrophic breakdown of the social order in the world that doesn't exist anymore. In this sense, like there are descriptions of extreme violence, lawlessness, dehumanization, extrajudicial execution. Someone stole the cow, it was lynching. Like if people found them, they were killing people in their gardens for stealing onions. Banditry. There are these vivid descriptions that people had to lock their houses at night because, you know, anything could happen. They were afraid to walk because you could be stolen and cannibalized. There was no police. These kind of crimes were never prosecuted, and there is an account, he says, you know, one night there were 17 people killed in our village and no one cared. Then church traditions, entire families, and sometimes even villages are gone. For instance, there are villages that do not exist anymore. They're at the bottom of the Kremenchuk reservoir, or there are villages that are not populated anymore because of the Chernobyl. Contribution to a history of childhood and of a generation whose childhood was profoundly affected. I had 2 pages more, but you know, maybe for another presentation. There is a lot of information. It's about, let's see, maybe trauma, stigma and bullying, how they were bullied in school, how they had to carry a stigma throughout their lives, semi-literacy, debilitating effect of dropping out of school, the need to work for a ration in kolkhoz, bullying, being too sick, lacking clothing, fear of leaving the house, and women are particularly affected. You can see from their accounts that really they were trapped in a life of manual labor, humiliation, deprivation. They feel powerless and insecure. And then cannibalism, familial cannibalism, or for instance, there are things like comparison between orphanages and patronages. Like I haven't figured out what is the good way to translate the patronage. But from the perspective of a child, it was better to be in the patronage because it was usually in the village and they had better chances of survival, while in the orphanage, which is the Tyachi Budinok, there is this heartbreaking account from Lubny, and the woman just basically described dozens of children were dying. They were just burying them outside in the garden, and she gives the address, so that's something interesting. How to say it, interesting, something to investigate, and basically she didn't even expect to survive because like they were starving and they were sick and they were receiving no help. Or for instance, there is an account from Poltava Yuzhny railway station. It was a pickup point for those like parents would drop off their kids, and this woman, she was a student herself, barely surviving, but she said that was the most heartbreaking picture she saw in her life because they were in pairs taken to the orphanage. Okay. I wanted to give an examples of some testimonies and even read one out, but I guess you will have to go and read them yourself. So this is just an example of the testimony. These are like the keywords. So basically the topics that are mentioned in one testimony, which is 3 pages long, but they describe all kinds of experiences, and they're very detailed in terms, you know, how they survived. This is the one about the disruption of the social order. I more or less kind of mentioned some of the topics. This one of the guy who was orphaned by the famine, and he, like for instance, he discusses the significance of the cow. You know, cow is the mother of the family. If the family had kids and cow was taken away, it was a death sentence. How they were writing letter to the OGPU about returning the cow, and then basically everybody died and the guy was left alone. And he said, you know, that he felt nothing but emotional numbness until he went to the cemetery and slept at the cemetery near to the graves of his parents, and then after that he could move on. Or this one is about kids who run away. They had like 4, I'm sorry, just 1 more minute, because I just think this is the whole point of it. For instance, here, 5 chickens remained laying 2 eggs a day. The family of 4 was living on half an egg every day. So he was deprived of his half because his older brother was working, and he was not really able to bring anything. He was making ink out of something, sometimes selling, but he wouldn't get his half an egg because this is how the family was to survive. So they, 2 kids, I think they were around 8 years old, they decide that they're going to die, and they find a way to get to Odessa. There they beg on the streets, they help people in the cafeteria. Then they make their way back, and then they sleep on the railway station. Someone cuts their bag where there was some bread, but the other guy had his money sewn into his lining of his jacket. So then he comes back to the village. So he says the famine was over. But what he notices, he said that people had an uprising. Then their agricultural implements were taken away, in private houses had no tin roof. It was taken for the needs of kolkhoz. And tin roof, it's like a cow. Usually if you had a tin roof, you were most likely to be designated as a kurkul, or then you come back to the village and there is no tin roof. It means, you know, like Holodomor is over, everything is over, everybody goes to the kolkhoz because they won't survive without the ration. So this is just, you know, kind of very general characterization, but I think it's interesting because it's raw, it's rich in details, and, you know, it gives you a lot of accounts that talk about the same things in different ways, so you can, you know, capture all this experience, however horrible it in different ways, and also this unique, incredible accounts of how people find the way to survive. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, all participants of this panel, and we still have some time for discussion, and I hope we will have several questions and we can take a collection of questions now from the floor. Yes, yes, please.
Referring to something that John had talked about, and that is how the deniers find ways to deny, and what got me thinking was the way you described how they treated the dead in burial in secret, in mass graves, etc. And if you look now in the Donbass, how they have treated the dead, thrown them down mine shafts, buried them in secret ceremonies in their towns or villages without people knowing where they died, why they died. So you have this pattern of denial and lying and deception throughout history on various topics, and obviously for this conference on the issue of the Holodomor. So the question is somebody perhaps working on a credibility project to show the similarities in treatment of various issues by Moscow and how they are consistent throughout history right to the present day?
My question is to Olga and to Anastasia, and as an archivist, I find it particularly important to make your assets or your archival resources discoverable to as broad of an audience as possible. For example, recently the Shaw Foundation created MARC records for all 55,000 of testimonies housed in the archive, and they are now discoverable through the library, global library cooperative called WorldCat. Are you considering, or have you considered creating MARC records for the photographs and the letters?
It basically was mentioned in Anastasia's and my presentation, but maybe, you know, we didn't focus on it that much. It's about the collaboration between HREC and this, our Digital World organization, because they provide the software which would make all this testimony. So we're in the process, so we prepare them. Now we have to post them. That's why, you know, this was especially useful, because it kind of helps my thinking through these categories, you know, tags, you know, locations. Like you mentioned gender. For instance, I didn't think of gender, but now I think, okay, I have to, you know, know gender too. So because now we are, with this project, with the Maniak project, I am in the stage of kind of preparing these testimonies for posting, so that kind of takes precedence, but we will be posting them, like, hopefully soon, because we just recently talked in the summer, we started talking to our Digital World for that specific reason. So how do we make them entirely searchable by all kinds of words, but I think keywords or subjects, they help to capture the content that might not be searched by regular search, especially, you know, if you have testimonies written in Surzhyk. So, you know, you might not find what you're looking for unless you know how they called it there. So yes, that's basically the purpose of all of it. We digitize all these records and we want to make them available, and then we might want to make them fully searchable. And also one of the purposes is also to make them interactive, because their software has this feature, I think, mystery questions. So if we are not sure, for instance, there was one account and the guy was describing that, comparing 3 famines, and he was saying, but in 1946 we were going to that place and exchanging things there, and I searched all kinds of ways, I cannot find the place. So we can attach a question like, do you know what is this? And hopefully someone from Cherkasy Oblast knows what it is, and they can write a response. So it will be open-ended, and the same people can comment, and then we can review and post comments and attach it, and and there will be with the possibility of linking it to other records, or link to other records with the same name. So this is the idea. So this is the ultimate goal. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I've got the microphone here. Thank you. I mean, the work that you're describing, Olga, is so important because it would make it possible then to compare the Maniak Collection to the Harvard project. I mean, once you set up the themes and the keywords and all of that. I mean, one thing that struck me in looking at the eyewitness accounts written between 47 and 55, if we include the Black Deeds of the Kremlin, is how often the word terror comes up. Terror. All the time. And I couldn't read your list, so I couldn't see if that's there.
No, it's not the word. I don't think it featured prominently. That's why I was saying, these are the things which were expected of people to write, but they write about other things and using other words.
Yeah.
That's why I was saying it's kind of uncontaminated, because it could be that those people who already had the experience of living abroad learned some different language for describing the same things. And here you mostly deal with people who had like 5 grades of education, 7 grades of education, who dropped out of school, so they don't really have a word for that, because terror.
But in the Harvard project, I mean, most of the respondents are in fact peasants. I mean, they're not reading Hannah Arendt. And so the fact that it reoccurs, but in any case, and I was wondering, John, as you look through the Mace Commission, I mean, did you see that word or not?
One question, and then we are going to answer. Just short answers. Thank you.
So my question is that, of course, now the Crimean archives are not accessible. Let's put it like this, but they were accessible until 2014. At the same time, in the 1930s, it was not in terms of the belonging. It didn't belong to Ukraine. So, did you use, or anyone use the materials from, or memoirs, or something else from the Crimean territory, at least to compare how it was in the Crimea compared to Ukraine? Because I'm asking this because even from my view from the outside, I'm not in the field, essentially, but it's clear that, say, in the Jewish colonies in the Crimea, the situation differed from the situation in the Jewish colonies in Ukraine. Do you have anything to compare, or to compare, say, with the situation on the border with Ukraine, or something else? These sort of things. Thank you.
So I suppose we can start answers, but just in short. Just one question here.
Hi. I'm struck by the ongoing resistance to acknowledging or recognizing that the Holodomor took place. I mean, there's been talk in the last 2 days about witnesses at the time refusing to see what they saw. There was talk about interviewers refusing to hear what they heard. Some of you have spoken about the invisibility of the event and how that was traumatic, etc. I'm struck by the fact that to this day, reputable people seem to want to continue to deny the Holodomor. For example, one of the leading, if not the leading, Sovietologist in the United States has just published a biography of Stalin in which he basically waves the Holodomor away as sort of not really having happened. Those of you who have looked at some comparisons of the Holodomor to other analogous events, have you come across a similar reluctance or resistance to acknowledging and recognizing that that which happened happened?
A small comment. I was in charge at the Polish embassy in late 2000s, and during this experience, I just spread a brochure to other embassies about Holocaust, and a part of this brochure was devoted to comparison with Armenian genocide. Guess who reacted directly to the Polish embassy? Of course, Turkish embassy. Of course, they of course denied the existence of Armenian genocide. So it is general approach of persecutors, or the state who was responsible for this. It's rather obvious for me.
So I suppose I invite speakers to give short answers and reflections. Okay.
So I will try and address the three questions that I've heard in order briefly. To the first one, I hadn't thought so much about the implications of the way that people were disposing of bodies in the present day. I hadn't thought of that, and it's something I think that is very interesting to point out. What I think in the research that I've found with the 32-33 famine and the 46-47 famine is that 32-33 sets a real precedence on how to get rid of people when you don't want them around anymore. And this is something that is appearing in the testimonies. And I think that careful research will help to kind of elucidate the way that these types of things are happening. So to answer your question briefly, I don't know of any credibility projects at the moment, although the research that I presented today is part of a chapter of my dissertation that looks at this more in depth and actually involves on-the-ground research, actually visiting the graves themselves and looking further into the 30s. We see this with the Nkavida trials, and this is where I talked about this in my paper of switching from semi-secret to secret. These things start to be conducted more at night. They're conducted in private areas, as the one that I described here today. So it's something that I think needs more attention, and we also need something similar to what the Rohatyn Cemetery Initiative has done in Ukraine to preserve Jewish cemeteries. Something like that in regard to Holodomor graves and burial sites would be a much needed resource I think that we could benefit from. The second question I think was from Olga Andreevsky on, you said the word of care, is that correct? Terror, yes. It appears, I think, somewhat often in the testimonies. I've seen it, if that's what you're asking. I've also ran the testimonies through some online resources that kind of calculate keywords similar to what Olga had showed us. And the word is there, but it's not by any means, I think, one of the more common ones, so to speak. And to the issue of denial that was brought up, I face this issue sometimes at other conferences, specifically from people that are very unaware of what 32-33 is and what it means and the significance of the famine and the Holodomor. And I've been at conferences, specifically ones on Holocaust and genocide, where Holocaust deniers will sit in the audience and provoke you in the questionnaires. In fact, in 2017 at the Millersville conference that Olya was at, actually, and Bohdan, I don't know if they remember if they were in a session, but there were some Holocaust deniers that actually came with their white supremacist T-shirts and would sit in the audience. And so these people still tend to kind of infiltrate, I think, the audiences, and they're not always maybe active in their denial, but they certainly want you to know that they have a different belief in what happened in the past. So yes, it's still an issue.
About disposing the bodies, I'm just thinking, like, in the accounts that I read, the most prominent topic is the desacralization of the burial rites. So for many people, it's painful that they couldn't give decent burial rites. And it was often just because they were physically not capable of doing that. So there are two types of accounts about the burial brigades who were picking up people who were still alive and dumping them, and it's all because, you know, like they wanted their ration and they didn't want to come back the next day. And there are 2 or 3 stories of miraculous survival, that someone was walking by and heard the voice and pulled the people out of those, you know, large graves, or someone managed to climb out of it, and there was a young woman, they were dragging her, and she was like, I'm so young, I want some beads, please save me. They pushed her there, they kind of stomped on her head so that she would stop complaining, and she died later in the grave. So in those accounts that I read, it's all about, you know, not being able to give people proper burial. But we also have to remember that this, you know, I'm not sure if it's entirely related, but the Soviet Union, you know, like the gulags, the concentration camps, those were the, you know, the places where so many people were just slaughtered, you know, and buried in unmarked graves. So here, at least in some cases, people know where theoretically the graves are. So I don't know, you know, if we can trace this kind of disrespectful attitude to Holodomor or to other factors. So here it's about desacralization. You know, this is how we used to do it, and now we were incapable of doing it. That's the prominent theme. With Crimea, because we're now talking about specific collections, so we kind of, you know, looking at what we can learn from what we have. So it is possible that in 400 remaining letters, we will find something from Crimea, because the letter, the one that I quoted about this, you know, horrific scenes of, you know, violence and social disruption and devastation, that was a letter sent from Russia. I think it was from Gukova, by the way, which is interesting, in Rostov Oblast, but the person was originally from Ukraine. So it is possible that we have something from Crimea. If we don't have, it could be because, as I said, it was a large collection. It could be that we just are not in the possession of that part of collection, or people from Crimea didn't send letters. We don't know, because then if you remember, there was a table. So basically, if you look at the table, people were sending from everywhere and speaking about events, writing about events occurring in different parts of Ukraine. So it is possible that I haven't found one account from Crimea yet, but that's definitely something worth looking at. Denialism in sources, I'm trying to, there were about 3 accounts that could be kind of categorized as denialism of some sorts. One was, I remember that was a person, they were working at Novomoskovskaya Novomoskovsk mechanical station, so where they provided the agricultural equipment for that specific rayon. So, and that was apologetic of Stalin, but not in an aggressive way, but in a way saying, you know, it was not Stalin who organized the famine. It was the Ukrainian party leadership, because there was no famine in other areas. So they did it. They did it. It's their fault. And, you know, like in the spring, they started bringing food. Then people were working. They were receiving good rations. And, you know, things were really good, actually. So, you know, like, as I said, it's like a personal cult of the new type. Then people say that Stalin did it and blaming famine on Stalin. There was a couple of letters, but those were from literally illiterate people. One was written by a grandson of a woman. It's not in this batch, but it's in the next batch. I looked at it because it's my on my mother's, my relatives come from Teofipil Rayon, which used to be Vinnytsia Oblast at the time. Now it's Khmelnytska Oblast. And I found, there is an account from Teofipil Rayon. I open it, and it says, we lived, everything was fine in the village, but there were these kurkuli, and why the famine happened? Because people didn't have anything, and kurkuli didn't want to give the grain. And then the kurkuli, they came and threatened the head of the village council. And the next day that head of the village council resigned. And then they sent the head of the village council from outside, and he dealt with them, and they were all sent away. But during the war, they all came back, they all collaborated with the Nazis, and they were killing people. And then she's like, we were going to the clubs, life was great, there were performances in the club, and I'm like, it's really interesting. So, it's like probably similar to what we think of as fake news now. Like if people living in this world can have certain ideas that they have no reference in real life. So to me, it sounded a lot, like something, this is what she heard of kurkuli. Then another very uneducated account, he was writing about I think taxes on daughters, that the Soviet authorities imposed some 800 ruble taxes on unmarried daughters, and I heard that the famine was caused by kurkuli. And finally, there were a couple of heartbreaking accounts. One was from a woman, and she was like, yeah, there were people in our village, they were doing horrible things. There was this woman, they were killing people, they were mutilating people. But why are we still talking about? Let's buy gun, be by gun. Like in the 80s, there was everything in the stores, and we were capable of buying washing machine. And now go to the store, there is no washing machine. And I survived the Holodomor, and now I have to wash everything by hands. That's the issue. This is what we have to talk about. So it's actually, at least in the letters that I read, there is, like, as I said, these are the examples that stood out. Everything else, I cannot say that anybody was denying it out of this, like 100 letters that I read. And terror, maybe like occasionally people would use it, but what I mean, it was not a word that it was used prominently. That's why I'm trying not to use, how to say it? I cannot say that I'm not using the words that are not used, that they are not using, because I devise this category like strategies of survival. Definitely it's not what people say, okay, this was my strategy of survival. Of course, it's kind of my imposition. But sometimes I think we tend to use contemporary terms describing the events in the past. So I'm trying to be respectful of that text. So that's probably all I have to say.
We have already run out of time. Yes,
okay,
if there are some reflections of participants, and then I would like to ask the participants of our final panel, and for their insightful presentation and a lot of food for thought for us. Thank you a lot.
It was not as painful as I expected. But you guys gave excellent presentation.